The dissolution of the Oedipus complex. Sigmund Freud. The dissolution of the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is being designated more and more clearly as the central phenomenon of the early infantile sexual period. Then the dissolution occurs. It succumbs to repression and is followed by the latency period. But we have not yet seen clearly what are the causes that bring about its end. The analysis seems to attribute it to the painful disappointments suffered by the subject. The girl who believes she is the preferred object of her father's love receives a harsh correction from him one day and finds herself expelled from her happy paradise. The child who considers his mother his exclusive property sees her suddenly direct her love and care towards a new little brother. But also in those cases in which special events such as those cited as examples do not occur, the absence of the desired satisfaction ends up diverting the childish lover from his hopeless inclination. The Oedipus complex would succumb to its own failure, the result of its internal impossibility. Another hypothesis would be that the Oedipus complex has to disappear because the moment of its dissolution arrives, as the milk teeth fall out when the permanent ones begin to form. Although the Oedipus complex is also experienced individually by the majority of human beings, it is, however, a phenomenon determined by heredity, and it will disappear according to a predetermined trajectory, when the next phase of development begins. It will therefore be indifferent what the occasional reasons for disappearance are and even that we cannot find them. Both hypotheses seem justified. But they are also easily reconcilable. Beside the broader phylogenetic hypothesis there is room enough for the ontogenic. The entire individual is also destined, from his very birth, to die, and also has already been indicated, perhaps in the disposition, his organs, the cause of his death. But it will always be interesting to pursue how the default program develops and how its arrangement is exploited by random malicious actions. Our insight has recently been sharpened by the observation that the child's sexual development proceeds to a stage in which the genitals have already assumed the leading role. But this genital is only the masculine, or even more exactly, the penis. The female genital remains unknown. This phallic phase, which is at the same time that of the Oedipus complex, does not continue to develop into a definitive genital organization, but disappears and is replaced by the latency period. But his disappearance takes place in a typical way and is supported by regularly emerging events. When the male child subject has concentrated his interest on his genitals, he reveals it with manual handling, and it does not take long to notice that the older ones do not. They agree with that behavior. More or less precise, more or less brutal, the threat arises to deprive him of that much esteemed part of his body. This threat of castration almost always comes from one of the women who usually surround the child, who often try to strengthen their authority by ensuring that the punishment will be carried out by the doctor or by the father. In some cases they themselves carry out a symbolic attenuation of their threat, announcing not the mutilation of the genital organ, passive in reality, but that of the hand, actively sinful. Very frequently it happens that the infantile subject is not threatened with castration for tinkering with the penis, but for wetting the bed every night. His keepers then behave as if this nocturnal incontinence were the consequence and testimony of the touching of the genital organ, and they are probably right. In any case, such long-lasting incontinence can be compared to adult pollution, being a manifestation of the same genital excitement that at this time has prompted the child to masturbate. We will now have to affirm that the child's phallic genital organization succumbs to this threat of castration, although not immediately, and without other influences being added to it, since the child does not at first lend faith or obedience to the threat. Psychoanalysis has lately attached great value to two kinds of experiences which are not spared by any child and for which he should be prepared for: the loss of highly esteemed parts of his body, the loss, first temporary and then definitive, of the maternal breast, and the daily necessary expulsion of the intestinal contents. Only after having made a new one does the child begin to count on the possibility of a castration, and even then very hesitantly, against his will and trying to narrow the scope of his own observation. This remark, which finally breaks the child's disbelief, is his discovery of the female genitalia. There is always an opportunity for him to contemplate the genital region of a girl and convince himself of the lack of that organ, of which he is so proud, in a being so similar to him. In this way it becomes possible to represent the loss of his own penis, and the threat of castration then begins to take effect. For our part, we should not be as short-sighted as relatives and guardians of the child, who threaten him with castration, and ignore like them that the child's sexual life is not reduced exclusively to masturbation at this time. It also appears visibly in his attitude towards his parents, determined by the Oedipus complex. Masturbation is nothing more than the genital discharge of the sexual excitation corresponding to the complex, and it will owe its significance for all subsequent epochs to this relationship. The Oedipus complex offered the child two possibilities of satisfaction, one active and one passive. He could place himself in the father's place in a masculine attitude and treat his mother as he did, an attitude that soon made the father see a nuisance, want to replace the mother and let himself be loved by the father, thus making the mother superfluous. The child has only a very vague idea of what love satisfaction may consist of, but his organic sensations force him to believe that the penis plays some part in it. Nor has he had occasion to doubt that the woman also possesses a penis. The acceptance of the possibility of castration and the discovery that the woman appears castrated put an end to the two possibilities of satisfaction related to the Oedipus complex. Both brought with them the loss of the penis, the one, masculine as punishment, the other, feminine as a premise. If love satisfaction based on the Oedipus complex has to cost the loss of the penis, a conflict will arise between the narcissistic interest in this part of the body and the libidinous charge of parental objects. In this conflict the first power usually wins and the child's ego separates from the Oedipus complex. I have already indicated elsewhere how this process develops. Loads of object are abandoned and replaced by identifications. The authority of the father or parents, introjected into the ego, constitutes in it the note of the superego, which takes its rigor from the father, perpetuates his prohibition of incest and thus guarantees the ego against the return of libidinous object charges. The libidinous tendencies corresponding to the Oedipus complex are partly desexualized and sublimated, which is probably the case with any transformation into identification, and partly inhibited as to their purpose and transformed into sentimental tendencies. This process has saved, on the one hand, the genitals, removing from them the threat of castration, but, on the other, it has paralyzed them, depriving them of their function. With it begins the latency period that interrupts the child's sexual evolution. I see no reason not to consider the withdrawal of the ego from the complex of Oedipus as a repression, although most subsequent repressions occur under the intervention of the superego, whose formation begins precisely here. But the process described is more than a repression and is equivalent, when it is carried out perfectly, to a destruction and disappearance of the complex. We would be inclined to suppose that we have stumbled here on the limit, never precisely determinable, between the normal and the pathological. If the ego has really achieved no more than a repression of the complex will continue to subsist, unconscious, in the ID and will manifest its pathogenic action later. Analytical observation makes it possible to recognize or guess these relationships between the phallic organization, the Oedipus complex, the threat of castration, the formation of the superego and the latency period. They justify the claim that the Oedipus complex succumbs to the threat of castration. But this does not end the problem. There is still room for a theoretical speculation that can destroy the result obtained or shed new light on it. Now then, before embarking on this path we will have to examine a question that arose during the preceding discussion and we have left aside until now. The described process refers, as we have expressly said, to the masculine infantile subject. What trajectory will follow the corresponding development in the girl? Our material here becomes incomprehensibly much more obscure and insufficient. The female sex also develops an Oedipus complex, a superego and a latency period. Can a castration complex and a phallic organization also be attributed to him? Of course, yes, but not the same as in the child. The morphological difference must manifest itself in variance of mental development. Anatomy is destiny, we could say, glossing a phrase from Napoleon. The girl's clitoris behaves at first exactly like a penis, but when the subject has occasion to compare it to a boy's real penis, finds it small. His N feels this fact as a disadvantage and a reason for inferiority. For some time he consoles himself with the hope that he will grow up. With her, beginning at this point the complex of masculinity of the woman. The girl does not consider her lack of a penis as a sexual character, but explains it by supposing that at first she had a penis similar to the one she has seen in the boy, but that she later lost it by castration. He does not seem to extend this conclusion to the other women, to the older ones, but attributes to them, in complete agreement with the phallic phase, a complete male genitalia. The important difference, then, is that the girl accepts castration as a fait accompli, while the boy fears the possibility of its fulfillment. With the exclusion of the fear of castration, a powerful motive for the formation of the superego and the interruption of the infantile genital organization also disappears. These formations seem to be, more than in the child, consequences of external intimidation that threatens to lose the affection of educators. The girl's Oedipus complex is much more unequivocal than the boy's, and in my experience, it very rarely goes beyond replacing the mother and the attitude feminine with respect to the father. The renunciation of the penis is not supported without the attempt of compensation. The girl passes we could say that following a symbolic comparison from the idea of the penis to the idea of the boy. His Oedipus complex culminates in the long-held desire to receive a child from his father as a gift, to have a son by him. We experience the impression that the Oedipus complex is then slowly abandoned, because this desire is never fulfilled. The two desires, to have a penis and to have a child, remain intensely charged in the unconscious and help to prepare the female creature for its subsequent sexual role. But, in general, we have to admit that our knowledge of these developmental processes in the girl is highly unsatisfactory and incomplete. There is no doubt that the causal temporal relationships described here between the Oedipus complex, sexual intimidation, castration threat, the formation of the superego and the entry into the latency period are typical in nature, but I do not want to claim that this type is the only one. The variations in the temporal succession and in the chaining of these processes must be very important for the development of the individual. Since the publication of the interesting study by Orank on the subject of birth trauma, the result of this little investigation, namely the conclusion that the child's Oedipus complex succumbs to fear of death, cannot be accepted without discussion. Castration. But it seems to me still premature to enter this discussion for now, and perhaps also inappropriate to begin at this point the criticism or acceptance of Rank's theory. End. The dissolution of the Oedipus complex. Sigmund Freud.